avid curiosity in what new composers were writing. Her voice's intonational quality and attractive silvery sheen, adapted to an amazing variety of styles, and the secure technical base of her method never deserted her right up to her mid-60s. PHYLLIS Curtin, welcome.
Thank you very much.
As we are talking, the Metropolitan Opera is preparing for the premiere of Carlisle Floyd's Susannah. I think I can safely call you the godmother of this opera. We are going to talk about other things too, so I'd like to ask you to tell us in a condensed form your part in bringing this very fine American opera to the consciousness of the American public.
All right, I will try to be as condensed as I can. I was in Aspen, Colorado, I think it was the summer of 1953 or 54, when Carlisle Floyd came to visit there, and bringing with him the score to Susannah. He could tell you better than I just exactly why he came to me, but I had been singing people's new music. I told him that could he please come and play it for me. He played me the two arias. I absolutely loved them. The story as outlined to me was one that felt absolutely comfortable and real and close to me. Mac Harrell was in residence then, and Mac Harrell also had a similar background in terms of country and one thing and another. And I called Mac and said, please, Mac, let this young man, Carlisle Floyd, and me come and show you this opera. And Mac felt the same way as I did with the bits he heard. Carlisle was then teaching at Florida State University in Tallahassee. He called his dean and told him that we had liked his opera, and his dean said, well, if you can get those two people to sing it, we will give you a production. It turned out that Mac Harrell and I, putting our schedules together, had the identical 2 weeks in February of 1955. So we went to Tallahassee, and that's where the premiere happened. Mac and I came back to New York. We sang this to a number of producers. We sang all the parts. We did everything we could to get somebody to put this opera on. His neighbor in Larchmont was Eric Leinsdorf, who for 1 year ran the City Opera. We went to his house and sang again all the parts that we could do, and he decided to do Susannah. That's how it got to the New York City Opera, where it won the Critics' Circle Award and was on its way. How's that for a condensed
that's a
version?
wonderful condensation. And it's safe to say that here, after all these years, we are at the point where this opera is more popular than it ever was.
Yes, it's had a wonderful career. But I think that it's typical of a lot of us who know and love opera. We pay so much attention to what goes on in the major houses that we don't know that other things happen. This opera has had 800 to 1,000 performances across the country. It's been played in Europe in other languages. Yes. It's been successful regularly, but somehow we haven't noticed that so much. Consequently, I'm absolutely thrilled that it's finally here.
And actually, this conversation takes place actually the day before, I think, the opera's Metropolitan premiere.
Absolutely.
Why don't we hear you in the great aria, one of the wonderful arias that you like so much, Ain't It a Pretty Night? It's a beautiful aria, and it's not an easy one to sing.
No, it's not easy. Once all the craft is underneath it, then from there on out, it's all imagination. And then it works easily.
Yes. And you and I were discussing it while the music was playing, that it's become a very favorite piece for auditioning singers.
Indeed. Now that people really do sing things in English for opera auditions, this seems to be the overall favorite for sopranos.
Yes, well, the auditions that I'm associated with for the Richard Tucker Foundation, we have mandated it years ago that one of the 5 obligatory pieces should be in English.
Absolutely.
Yes. Actually, you took this opera to Europe, to Brussels.
Mm-hmm.
How did that come about?
That, I don't know really how it came about. I think that a big motivator in all of that perhaps was Jean Dalrymple. She was greatly involved with things, both the light opera and the regular opera company there, and she was a big mover and shaker in a lot of those fields. How it really came about, I don't know beyond that, but I know that we all worked very hard to get us there. The funding was hard to come by. It was very well received in Brussels, and one of my favorite things about it afterwards was that Adlai Stevenson was there for some reason, and he was quite taken with the opera. Also, a Russian journalist who was making his first very cautious trip outside of Russia at that time, and he came and spoke to me. He said the subject of bigotry is not just American, and then he vanished as if he'd been sucked into the ceiling, and I thought it was pretty brave of him to have done that at that point.
But it was essentially a New York City opera production, right?
Oh, indeed,
It was,
completely.
yes, completely.
Yeah.
That was quite a company in those days. Very enterprising, and you were very much part of it. Give us some of your recollections.
All right. First of all, our seasons were very short in those days. Maybe we ran, 3 weeks or 4 weeks? Do you remember, in the spring and again in the fall? And everything that was done had to be rehearsed fast. You had to arrive pretty much knowing everything. There was no time to fiddle around. My particular delight was that the people, the singers who were there, really were a true company. We cared about each other. We enjoyed working together. We looked at making an opera together, and that saw us through all kinds of difficulties, like not perhaps getting the opera fully staged before opening night, all kinds of marvelous, funny things. But it was a company that was full of vitality and enormous care for what it was we did. It was a question of all of us being fascinated by the opera and not being fascinated by the opera for our own sakes. And I, in the course of a very long career in opera houses, found that that was a beautiful and very rare quality.
And you had a very valuable and interesting association with Norman Treigle.
Well, yes. Norman came into the Susannah situation because Mac Harrell couldn't. After he had done such beautiful work, to help get this thing seen. Then, as it turned out, when it was the dates we had for Susannah at City Opera, he couldn't do. And that's when Norman came along. And Norman and I did have a wonderful time together. We cared a great deal about how we sang and how we acted. And he was one of the 2 singers that I ever talked to about the craft of singing. That's a subject best left alone most of the time with your colleagues. He named his daughter Phyllis Susannah Treigle, which I think is just beautiful. But we sang together a lot, and he was in Salome with me. We did Carlisle's Passion of Jonathan Wade, other things, and it was always a wonderful association that I enjoyed.
You had a
enormously.
special name for Salome, right?
Yeah, we called her Sally Mae. Did you remember that?
That's the Southernism, right?
Yes, absolutely.
But after your very distinguished career with the New York City Opera ended, your international career began, and You named one of the Mozart arias as a special favorite of yours. We're going to hear it now, and then you tell us where you sang it. Of course, I'm talking about Così tutte, and where you sang Fiordiligi and what other associations it recalls.
Thank you.
Scoglio from Così tutte. Also not an easy piece to sing. In fact, possibly the toughest.
Maybe, but I found she is such an engaging character. And there again, I think that this aria is a heavenly example of self-intoxication. She's being so noble and so all of this. And of course, the young man and Don Alfonso, everybody's playing up to this and encouraging her. And it's just marvelous. She's being very successful with this. So she can't help but sort of outdo herself and then ornament it a little more. And it's such a heavenly feeling of being so wonderfully, nobly right. And so I found, as I say, if you've got the craft underneath it, then what makes that craft really work for me is the character. And Fiordaligi, she's just fun. And once I turned into her, and therefore, if she's like that here, what happens to her later in the opera with the Per Pietà is a heartbreaking experience. I mean, it's really marvelous. This opera says so much about
the human condition.
Yes. And young love, especially.
Yes. You took that opera to Vienna, of all places?
Well, this opera was very good to me. Where did I do it first? A group of us out of Columbia artists did Così tutte with symphony orchestras across the country, on and off for several years. The tenor David Floyd staged it, and we were there again, a wonderful little troupe. It was my debut piece, but one in Vienna, and at La Scala, and at the Metropolitan. It was my debut. And it was fascinating to have all of that, plus those long tours with it. It became so much a part of my life, and that of a group of us, particularly the tour group, that, you could play a chord someplace and we'd all just spring into the scene, the action, and everything is right there. And it was by far my favorite Mozart lady to sing.
Right. Well, here is that was one of your great favorites, which you sang many times. We are going to hear something that you sang only in concert, which was not in your repertoire, actually, the role of Maddalena in Andrea Chénier. Quite different from the classic Mozart style. It's a Verismo opera, although I might add that I consider Susannah a Verismo opera too.
Oh, I do too.
An American Verismo.
Indeed.
But for an entirely different type of Verismo, we are going to hear La Mamma Morta, and then you'll tell us about why you like this aria. Mamma Morta from Giordano's Andrea Chénier. An opera you never sang on stage,
No.
unfortunately.
Sometimes people say, why didn't you ever sing whatever it is? And I say, because nobody asked me.
Well, in those days, it was rarely, if ever, performed
That's
in the
true.
States.
That's
We have
true.
to be fair about that. My guest is PHYLLIS Curtin. In Vienna before, and you told us that you sang, among other things, Fiordiligi in Mozart's Così fan tutte. Among other things were Violetta and Salome.
Yes.
It's not a logical combination of two operas. Tell us
No,
about
it isn't.
that.
Yes, it is interesting, but I think there again, in casting, temperament is a big factor, as well as what regards, as well as looking at vocal types. And if the temperament, as an actress or a performer, can handle that range and the voice can follow it, then it doesn't seem to be a problem. And it certainly wasn't in Vienna for me. And it is a curious thing. But the Mozart, if you sing good Mozart, you stay healthy, I think. And so it was not a problem to sing Salome and Così in the same week.
Besides, your voice had a kind of a fresh lyric quality to it. And Salome was supposed to be a teenager after all, so you did need a young-sounding voice, which...
Well, you know,
well,
that's
certainly.
interesting. That was an early assignment of mine at the City Opera. Joseph Rosenstock thought that I should do that. And I was simply staggered at the idea. And he, just as you have said, was, after all, this is a young girl. This is not a Wagnerian person. This is not a middle-aged lady. This is not an experienced person. And I had, strangely enough, before I ever thought about singing, known the Oscar Wilde play. And so I was really engaged with the thought and didn't know enough to be frightened by it. And I had a marvelous teacher who insisted I learn the whole row as a vocalise on ah, so that he said, when you turn on all those passions, you'll be able to handle them vocally. And he was right. And I sang this part happily and well for years. When I say for years, I did not have that many opportunities to do it on the stage, but the final scene became a part of my regular orchestral repertory with many orchestras here and abroad. And it's really a pretty thrilling thing to do. That's a big orchestra. When it's in the pit,
Yes, when they're
you
on
don't
stage.
feel it so much, but on the stage, it's something else. And one time in Hamburg, I was singing with Hans Schmidt-Isserstedt, whom I liked very much. And it was a Strauss centennial year. We had done the 4 last songs in the first half, and then as we came in for the second half for Salome, he looked at me and smiled. He said, well, here we go, 104 against 1. But there's something about leaning on that wall of sound which is very exciting.
Yes. But it's a problem to balance it sometimes.
Yes,
It's up to the conductor
but that's
to
the
balance it.
conductor's
Yes.
problem. I have one pair of vocal cords, and he's got 104 people, and he can certainly do something about that. Adding a decibel on my part will not do any good.
Well, Salome may or may not have been the ideal role vocally for you, certainly histrionically, yes, but there is no question that Violetta was. And you did sing it a lot, and we are going to hear you right now in Addio del passato.
Teneste la promessa, la disfida ebbe luogo, il barone fu ferito, però migliore. Alfredo in strano suono, il vostro sacrificio io stesso li ho svelato, egli a voi tornerà del suo perdono. Io pur verrò, curatevi, meritate un avvenir migliore. Giorgio Jellinek. E attendo,
Verdi's Violetta. By the way, I should add that with your wonderful and wide range of repertoire, your recordings have not been available for a long, long time. They are currently available, and all the selections we are hearing today are available on the Video Arts International label, VAI. You mentioned your many, many recordings with orchestras, large and small, and of course that involved major works such as Bach and Beethoven, Missa Solemnis, and tell us a few others.
Oh, goodness, let's see. Recordings with orchestra, one of my very favorites, I don't know if any of these are available anymore, is the 14th Symphony of Shostakovich. Simon Estes and I were the soloists in the premiere of that, and RCA recorded it. It, I think, has simply staggeringly marvelous work, and I sang that with a variety of orchestras. And indeed, with one in Minnesota, Stanislav Skorovačevsky was the conductor, and he wanted to do it in English, but he didn't want it if it couldn't be in English. Since he was one of the few conductors that I knew who spoke Russian, it interested me, and he said, people have to understand this. And I said, well, would you do it if I did a translation? And he said, yes. So I did a translation into English of this work, and we did it, and that was fun. There are, with the Boston Symphony, Der Wein of Alban Berg, which we did in French, Le Vin. And that was that's where it came from originally. It had been translated by Stefan Georg from French into German, and Mr. Lansdorf wanted to do it in the original French. That was fascinating. I turned up for the rehearsal. We began. I was all memorized. We start, and I began, and suddenly he rapped on the stand. Said rather nicely and politely, quietly, "You came in early." That sort of stopped me in my tracks. I knew I had not. So we started again, and this time he was not so polite. He said, "Phyllis, you're early." I said, "My score has it this way." We discovered thereby that there were 2 editions in French. And which to do was interesting. One had many note and rhythm changes, which was mine, and what was in his score was quite different. So I took it to Darius Milhaud and said, which of these suits the language the best? And he chose the one that I had done, which was a great relief to me since I was memorized. With that orchestra, I also did Wozzeck excerpts, Le Martyr de Saint-Sébastien with Charles Munch. There's a lovely old, Handel, Samson.
Yes, that's right.
That was a lovely one that came out. So there weren't a lot. Yes. I didn't have a big discography, alas. I'm so thrilled to have these now. They have been the greatest
But you
gift.
did the 4 last songs, right, of Strauss?
Not recorded.
I didn't mean recording. And,
you mean orchestral repertoire?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Sure.
So those were just recordings that I mentioned.
No.
I had a big orchestral repertoire. Sure. Yes, the 4 last songs, many, many times. Les Illuminations de Rimbaud of Britain, which I just adore. There were all kinds of orchestra programs. Mrs. Solemnis, yes, but lots of St. Matthew's and St. John's and all of those lovely things.
And since you mentioned Britain, you recorded, I don't know if you recorded it, but you certainly performed Ellen Orford in Peter Grimes.
Oh, yes.
And also you sang the War Requiem by
Oh, yes.
Britain.
That, I think, is one of the major musical things of this century. That made me think more about war and peace and religion than anything that ever happened in my life. I must have sung that work 30, 35 times. And it is a powerful thing. I think it's probably the singular most, if I were to pick the most important thing, musical, that I ever was able to take part in, it would be War Requiem.
Yeah. You also did a lot of work with Leonard Bernstein, right?
Yes. Yes, the very first thing was Peter Grimes. At Tanglewood in 1946. I was the first niece, and I think it was his first full-length opera, for that matter. So we started there, and I sang with him and with the Philharmonic and a variety of places. We did Poulenc, Les Bamères de Thérésias at the Brandeis Festival. We sang together, Mrs. Solemnis, all kinds of things. It was a nice relationship.
Let me, before I was going to say, let me turn to your teaching and coaching activities, which are very important. But before we get to that, since we already mentioned Strauss' last songs, you performed in a rarely heard Strauss opera, Intermezzo.
Do you remember that?
Well, I did my research.
You did your research. That was fascinating. I think about it often for two reasons. One, every now and again a singer will say, "Oh, I really don't like that." And I said, "Well, you may not like it, but if you're engaged to sing it, it is your job to sing it as if it were the most important and beautiful thing you ever did." That's how I came to feel about Intermezzo. I didn't like Intermezzo. But on the other hand, once I gave myself over to Frau Storch, I had a pretty good time. That was fun to do.
Did you play her as a harridan or
well, I play her as she turns up in the opera.
Yes.
And it's been so long ago I can't quite remember, but the harridan aspects do show.
Yeah. You sang, of course, some of the big Strauss roles like Ariadne and Marschallin.
Yes. I actually, when people say, are there things you wish you'd done, I had such a happy career, I don't regret anything except that I never really performed Marschallin on stage.
On stage, yeah.
I sang excerpts. That was something I did with both Ormandy and Bernstein, Marschallin. I covered it one year at the Met, where Mr. Bing had all those fine European ladies singing it, and therefore I couldn't. Though they called on me all of a sudden for the tour, but I couldn't do that. I was engaged in London at that time. But I always wished I had. That was something that I felt I could identify with and do well.
Now let's turn to your current activity. You are a teacher, you're a dean of, what is your exact title at Boston
Well,
University?
I have retired from that title. I was dean of the School for the Arts at Boston University. That's was the schools of visual arts, theater, and music. And I did that for 9 years. I adored it. But after a while, I decided I really couldn't see myself being at school anymore 7 days a week and 7 nights a week, because I taught as well.
Yes.
So then I just continued to teach.
And some of our most successful younger singers came out of your workshop, so to speak. Name a few, and then you can add a few more. Cheryl Studer, Sanford Stillman, John Ayler, Dawn Upshaw. At what point did they come to you in their careers?
Early. These were people who came to Tanglewood, basically. I can no longer, I've been doing Tanglewood, this will be the 35th summer, so it's hard for me to remember exactly when people were there and at what state they were. Most of them were graduate school age, I should say, of that group. Just out of college or conservatory, perhaps, or maybe just finishing up. But they come to Tanglewood by audition, and it's a very lively and remarkable group of young people who come there. I've found that to be because I started it in the heat of my own career, and my management was very displeased with me because they were hearing from orchestra managers, well, if she's teaching, she can't be singing anymore. That's a terrible thing to say about singing teachers, that they only teach when they can't sing anymore. I think those classes are why I sang so long without any vocal problems, because I could, with excitement, hear the littlest things and help fix them or help find the ways to them or ways of understanding singing that I would never have taken the time to do for myself. So it really, I discovered, as I had when I was 9 and taught my best friend dancing after I came home from my dancing lesson, that if you can teach really well, you learn so much yourself. That was a great benefit. Now with me now, I discover that I know far more about the art than I did even at the peak of my work. And I remember a quote I read from Leonardo da Vinci, who said, "The master teacher is one whose students learn from him to surpass him." And that's a very exciting thing, because you can help people understand fundamental tools, and then they can take those and run with their own artistry and imagination as far as it'll go. That's thrilling.
And you take pleasure and pride now in the accomplishments of
Oh,
some
well,
of
I
these
take
young
enormous
people who-
pleasure. And every now and again, I hear somebody who sings something so gorgeously that I sang myself. A Chinese student that I have, I heard her butterfly in St. Louis, and I always thought I was a fine butterfly. She's the best one I ever saw.
Imagine that.
Or heard. Yeah.
What drew you to the Latin American repertoire in which you excelled?
Oh, Latin American repertoire, I adore, and that came on very early. You probably remember that Nicholas Slanimsky, musicologist, wrote a book, I think it was 1948 it came out, called Music in Latin America. He lived in Boston, I lived in Boston.
He was quite a character. I
Oh,
know.
my
I knew
goodness,
him
he
well.
was fun. He was a wonderful man. And my husband and I took off 4 months and spent it in Ecuador and Peru. I fell in love with those countries in a very peculiar and totally intuitive, instinctive way. And when I came back, I went to see Slanimsky to find Latin American music. He had so much of it from having written that book. I remember he took a whole stack of it off the top of his refrigerator and some from